There are several ways to start your property investment journey. And in this video, we're going to deep dive into one of the most least spoken about ways. Now, oftentimes, as I've worked in the field of real estate and property investment, starting at the age of 19 when I got my first full-time job as an estate agent, fast forward to 2017 when I bought a property with over £100,000 of a discount, to today where I coach hundreds of people through means of our cash flow creation week and other forms of coaching and training. I find often that people are asking the question, how do I start? How do I get started? Now, my primary group of clients that I coach are not people at the beginning of their journey. It's not people starting, but nonetheless, every now and then we have people that are starting their journey, and this question comes up again and again and again. Now, I've asked myself recently, especially when you spend a lot of time with high-level entrepreneurs or high-level property investors, you ask yourself the question, if those people were going all the way back to the beginning and they were starting again, what would be one of the best ways for them to start? So what I'm going to be doing in these daily videos is I'm going to be sprinkling in some of the best ways to start kind of content to help you guys basically find ways, if you are at the start of your journey, that you can not have to go through what many of my high level coaching clients and even myself had to go through to start the journey. Okay, so we'll probably do a deeper dive video on some of these other strategies, but today we're going to be talking about one which I don't get to talk about enough, but I think is one of the most powerful ways that you could start your property investment journey, and that's through means of the vehicle of shared ownership. Okay, now in the UK, shared ownership is a conceptual idea that many people write off, but they write off for the wrong reasons. They write off because they say to themselves, well, the way shared ownership works, and I should probably start with a definition, which I'll come to in a moment, but they write off shared ownership because they assume that they own a share and some business or some entity, some organization owns another share, and as a result, they're not willing to share. All right. But as you've probably heard the old adage, sharing is caring. Okay. So because sharing is caring, there is actually a way through means of shared ownership that you can start your property investment journey. And in this video, I'm going to share with you exactly how you can do that, but also some of the big things. I'll go through about 3 of them that you should look out for in the process or in the journey. Now, to start with, let's define what shared ownership is, because this is going to be super helpful for you if you're someone who's starting out your journey, or if you're someone who's maybe built, like some of my clients, right? They've built massive portfolios of controlled properties. So they have a rent-to-rent portfolio, maybe generating them 5, 10, 15,000 pounds every single month, right? Different clients in different positions, but they haven't ever bought a property for themselves. And because they're self-employed or they're in a structure where they have a business, them getting a traditional mortgage and getting a mortgage for a 400,000 or 500,000 pound house might not work for them. So they're looking for paths in order to start their purchasing journey, even though they're kind of very well off in terms of cash flow as it pertains to their property journey. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's jump into what is shared ownership. Now, in a very simple way of thinking about it, shared ownership is where you buy a property but with a share of the ownership. Okay, so let's say, for example, shared ownership is very often done with apartments, flats. Okay, in America they call those condos. And what's interesting about shared ownership is one of the few strategies that are very prevalent here in the UK, which we don't hear as much of in the US of A. So to my brothers and sisters on the other side of the pond, this one is one that maybe you should listen to, think about, see if it can work for you, and let us know in the comments if this is of any value to you as well. So in the UK, we have this conceptual idea of shared ownership, where usually it originally started with a lot of housing associations and developers who basically had stock, had properties that they wanted to sell, but what they were finding in the UK was that the average income was not increasing as fast as the price and value of property. So how do you get around that? How do you still sell properties to people when their incomes aren't growing as fast as the price or the value of the properties? And ding ding, light bulb moment, the idea of shared ownership was basically released or unleashed onto the market in the UK. So what is it? Well, basically what happens is a third party organization, sometimes a housing association, sometimes the developers themselves, they offer you an opportunity to buy a share of the property. So let's use an example to make this super clear. Let's say a developer has built a building with 12 apartments inside of the building. And let's say a housing association has been given 3 of the apartments inside of that building, okay? So what the housing association would do is they'd say, well, we want to provide housing to specific key workers. They might be police officers, they might be fire brigade employees, they might be nurses, okay? Or it might be third party people, it might be teachers, could be anyone, right? So they offer this shared ownership opportunity to the marketplace. And the way it works is each of these 3 apartments may be £400,000 in terms of value. Okay, so the developer wants £400,000. The housing association who's facilitating the shared ownership, they are willing to pay £400,000. So what they do is they put out this offer for a share of the ownership to be purchased by an individual, by you or by me, right? Now, let's say the share they're going to make available is 50%. So what happens is I may say, okay, I want to purchase a brand new apartment, but for some reason, maybe financing isn't going to trigger at £400,000 of a property purchase due to your pay slips not being enough, or due to you not generating enough revenue currently, or whatever else, right? So what happens with the shared ownership is they will allow you to buy a 50% share of a £400,000 property in this example. And let's say this £400,000 property is a 3-bedroom apartment in this 12-unit building, okay? So although the value of the property is said to be 400,000, because I'm getting a 50% ownership, I get to purchase £200,000 worth of that property. And I will do that in what would look like the traditional approach. So I'd go through the whole buying process. The only difference is the conveyancing will not be signing me up for the complete purchase of the property. The conveyancing will be signing me up for a 50% share of the property. And what I would do is I'd put down my deposit. Let's say I need a 10% deposit or a 5% deposit, maybe using Help to Buy. Some shared ownership properties allow the Help to Buy to be used as well. So let's say I put down a 10% deposit on the 200,000 part that I'm buying, that's £20,000. And then let's say I get a mortgage for the rest of my 50%, which is the remainder of the 200,000. So 200,000 minus my deposit of 20,000, leaves £180,000 left. And let's say I get a mortgage on 180,000. So now every single month I'm expected to pay my mortgage payment for the £180,000 of the mortgage. Now, there's more, right? Because I've now purchased 50%, I purchased this with the intention to live in the property, okay? Because typically, shared ownership is not done as an investment vehicle. Shared ownership is done as a residential vehicle, okay? So I'm doing this as a residential process. So because I'm doing it as a residential process, the housing association cannot make any additional money off of the property. They can't give me half and let me have half like you would do in a duplex, which is something I spoke about in one of my previous videos. But instead, what happens is they're expecting you to live in the property all of the time. So as a result, they need to find a way to generate income or at least maintain their borrowing on their £200,000 part of their ownership, right? Their 50% share. So how do they do that? Well, the way they do that is by charging you a monthly rent, okay? So they charge you a monthly rent. So just for the sake of easy numbers, let's assume the monthly rent they're charging you for their £200,000 part is £1,000 per month, okay? So what you end up with is you end up with your mortgage payment for your 50% every single month. Let's just make it easy and say that's £1,000 a month. And then you end up with your rent payment for the other 50% of the house. Let's say that's £1,000 a month, right? So for the sake of easy numbers, we have just triggered a shared ownership purchase. We've purchased a whole apartment, which is valued, and I'm using air quotes when I say valued, because when developers and new builds are valued, a lot of the time, they're not actually valued the way property should be valued. And if you would love for me to do a video or deep dive on that, just let me know in the comments below and we can literally break that down, why I don't think 99% of people in the planet should ever buy new build properties, okay? Let me just add in the UK to make it kind of a little bit nice for you, right? But essentially, what happens now is we've just purchased a £400,000 property. We own 50% of that property. We've got a mortgage for £180,000 for our £200,000 of that property. And we've given a 10% deposit of £20,000 to get into that property. Now, the other 50% is the £200,000 owed and owned by the housing association in this fictitious example, and they will charge us a monthly rent for the benefit of being able to have the whole home, right? So let's assume the monthly rent is £1,000 every month, and let's assume that our mortgage is £1,000 every month. So we have to pay £2,000 every month to have full control of this £400,000 valued property. Now, that's a good definition with an example with a few numbers thrown in for what shared ownership is. Now, here's the question. If you want to start your property investment journey, why is shared ownership one of the most overlooked strategies or approaches to get into property? And I'm going to tell you point blank right now. It's because of the fact that most people are one-track minded when it comes to property. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is most people, either through experience or through stories, right? Because they've been told by people, oh, you can do rent to rent, or they've been told by people, oh, you can do buy to let, or they've been told by people, oh, you can do HMOs. Most people have their mind fixed on one path and one route, okay? I am like the complete opposite to that, which is why years ago, I created this program called 30 Ways in 30 Days. In this program, I'll read the subtitle to you. It says multiple ways to generate revenue using property, right? So in this program, which when I created it some time ago, I basically realized this was when I was hosting one of the largest property networking events in the whole of the UK. We would have over 100 landlords coming to our event every single month. And what I quickly discovered is most people only thought you can buy a house and rent it out, buy to let, or you can buy a house and sell it one day as a flip, right? And because I saw so many people with that mentality, I realized we need a broadened education around what can actually be done with property. Now, by no means do I assume that there's only 30 strategies you can apply to property, but both in this training, 30 Ways in 30 Days, I revealed 30 separate ways you can make money from property. And also in 2019, we ran a number of what we called the Get on the Ladder workshops, where we were sharing in each of those workshops 15 different strategies you can use to generate revenue from property, specifically if you're getting started, getting on the name Get on the Ladder workshop, right? Now, why did I find it so valuable to do this? Well, the first reason is because I find that my community seems to be last in the race when it comes to real estate and property in the UK. And that was something that was a big burden on my heart and still is to a large degree. I'm grateful and thankful that I've been able to work with a whole bunch of more higher net worth individuals as it pertains to their portfolios and property since then. But these were some of the things that were really incumbent upon me in terms of supporting and assisting the community. So that's why I went all in to kind of create training, deliver workshops and all of that stuff to help people move further faster in their future as it pertains to that. So because I discovered that, I realized that most people generally have like a one-track path on how they can use property. Oh, I'm going to buy this property and every 2 years I'm going to refurb the property and then I'm going to sell the property so I don't hit capital gains, and then I'm going to buy a bigger property and I'm going to live in that for 2 years. So that was one path that many people went down. The other path was, oh, I'm going to buy this property regardless of capital gains, do it up, sell it and keep living with my mum for the next 30 years, right? That was another path. Another path was, oh, I'm just going to build a portfolio as quick as I can, making £200 per property per month and build a portfolio to 500 properties and hopefully I'll make etc, right? So these were the said paths, and I realized that all of those paths were, most of them, because they're so common, it's just like anything in business, supply and demand, right? They've got the highest demand, and as a result, over time, the supply, the value in those specific strategies was just diminished. So those strategies don't make sense for people who really want to generate wealth, especially for people who want to generate wealth with some element of speed. And if you want to know more about that, watch the video that I did yesterday, which was super valuable as it pertains to wealth and speed and their relationship and connection. So these are some of the things that I discovered. These are some of the things I uncovered. And then I said to myself, okay, what can I do about it? And thus the answer was all of this training. So the reason why most people overlook very quickly shared ownership is because, just like any other strategy, A, they don't know how to navigate it, but more importantly, B, because most people are one-tracked as it pertains to generating revenue using property. Okay, so now let's talk about 3 things I think are the biggest stumbling blocks if you're using shared ownership in order to start building wealth in property, okay? The first thing is a cap on how much of the other percentage of ownership you can actually buy. Okay, so there are shared ownership programs out there, and again, I will say this: not all shared ownership programs are created equal. Okay, that's a big thing to think about, right? Which the moment I say that, like, that already opens up the whole portal of the world of finances of what can be done if you understand that not all shared ownership products are created equal in the first place. All right, so let's dig into this a lot deeper. So first and foremost, if you go and get a shared ownership product just like the one we just explained, and the housing association says you cannot buy the entire 50% that the housing association owns ever, that's not ideal. Why? Because what that basically means is you will never ever have a shot at total ownership, whether leasehold ownership or freehold ownership of that property. Okay, that's not cool. That's not cool. Why is it not cool? Well, it's not cool because if you do figure out how to generate wealth in a good way or a substantial way, and then you decide that you want to purchase that whole apartment, you'll never have the opportunity to, because they don't give you the option. So if you're looking at shared ownership, this is one of the things you should look at. Will you be able to acquire the other percentage which you haven't bought initially at some stage later on down the road? Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is connected to the first thing, so please beware of this as well. That is time constraints on your acquisition of the other percentage part. Okay, what do you mean, Samuel? Well, this is what I mean. If you buy 50% of the £400,000 property, you now own 50% at £200,000. Now, if the housing association or the organization offering you this shared ownership say to you that, okay, every 3 years you can buy an additional 10%. Well, what that means is at a rate of 50% over every 3 years, you would have to wait 3 years for the first 10%, 6 years for the second 10%, 9 years for the third 10%, 12 years for the fourth 10%, and then 15 years to be able to acquire the full other 50%. Okay, now I'm making these time frames up to make it very clear how this stuff works so that you can have a deep understanding of what you should be looking out for if you're someone who's pursuing a shared ownership acquisition, especially if long term you have a desire to build wealth. Okay, and why is that so important? Well, the first thing is important is, can you actually buy the percentage you didn't buy in the first place? And the second caveat is, how long do you have to wait to be able to buy it? The reason why is because sometimes, as mentioned earlier, you end up figuring things out that you never thought you could figure out. You might end up figuring out how to invest in property faster than you thought you were going to, because when you weren't looking into property at all, it felt like figuring anything out in property was going to take years. But now you've started looking into property, you start realizing, wow, a lot of the things I thought would take me 15 years, 20 years, 30 years to figure out, I'm now able to figure out in 15 days, 3 days, 30 days, right? And if that be the case, you can now become buyer ready, you can now become investment ready very quickly. And now having to wait 15 years in order to acquire the additional 50% of that property may not be something of interest to you. So that's the second caveat. Now, the third caveat is limitations. Limitations. What do you mean, Samuel? Well, in London boroughs, okay, London boroughs have been notorious to only provide assistance, and I guess this happens in most quote unquote first world nations across the world, right? But London boroughs especially are notorious for only providing assistance to people based on certain shortcomings. So for example, I remember years ago in around 2014, and it's probably the same now, but the numbers might have slightly changed. But in 2014, one of the criterias for social housing being provided to an individual in London through means of the London boroughs, the 33 London boroughs, was you have to have less than £16,000 in savings, okay? And then they had other criteria as well, but I'm just using the savings criteria as one specific thing, which is very easy to measure. Does that person have £16,000 or less in savings? Does that person have £16,000 or more in savings, right? It's a very simple metric. Now, if a person has more than £16,000 in savings, that would be one of the criteria which would make that person ineligible for being able to tap into social housing. Now, why is that important? It's important because when shared ownership first came around, shared ownership came around off the conceptual basic idea that they were supporting a person to acquire a property. And this is part of the reason why a lot of shared ownership programs, even still till today, are offered to key members of society, i.e. your teachers, i.e. your firefighters, i.e. your nurses, i.e. your police officers, and so forth and so forth. And this is really important to understand, because if they're assisting you, then they may have criteria to which they assign that assistance. It might be that you don't have over a certain amount of savings. It might be that you don't have a certain amount of income or over a certain amount of income, and so forth and so forth. Now, the reason this is important is because sometimes those limitations don't just stop for assessing you to purchase your share of the shared ownership. Sometimes those limitations stay on you until the end of your relationship with that shared ownership property. What do you mean, Samuel? Well, what I mean is a housing association could say to you, you can purchase 50% of this. You're eligible for the shared ownership program as long as you don't have over £30,000 in savings, for example. Okay, let's use this savings example. Now, you purchase this property using £20,000 out of your £30,000 or £28,000 in savings as your deposit. You now have roughly £8,000 in savings. Let's say you use some of that for fees. Let's say you got £3,000 in savings. Now, however you save that £28,000, let's say you go back on that journey to save money so that you can acquire the rest of the 50%. Now, every single time you get close to £30,000, you could become ineligible for retaining your share in that property, okay, if that shared ownership program has limitations. So it's important when you get into a shared ownership program to find out first, what are the limitations that allow you to basically be eligible for the program? And then are there any limitations that are held on you whilst you're a participant in the program? This is very, very important, just to make sure that you navigate above board and within the guidelines throughout the whole process, okay? So awareness is key. Now that I've shared 3 things to look out for, let me share some of the criteria that would make a shared ownership deal a very, very potentially lucrative deal. Now, one of the challenges with shared ownership is they're offered a lot of the time in apartments or in flats, right? And apartments tend to come with a service charge, an annual service charge. So if you're looking at a shared ownership property, and that shared ownership property, let's take the numbers that we used earlier on in this video. Let's say the shared ownership property you're looking at is worth £400,000 on paper. You've purchased a 50% share at £200,000. You've put down a 10% deposit at £20,000, and you have a mortgage for £180,000, of which you're paying, let's just say, £1,000 every single month. Now, for the other 50%, let's say the social housing organization, the housing association, have given you their £200,000 part, 50% portion, at a rent of £1,000 every month. So you're expected to pay out £2,000 every single month. Now, on top of all of that, you're going to have a service charge. Let's say your annual service charge is £3,000, which most people would say, hey, Samuel, that's a high service charge for an apartment. And it might be, right? Now, typically what would happen, I've had students sometimes give me these numbers and say, hey, Samuel, like, is this just a bad deal because of how much has to go out? And I've had to stop them and say, no, like, this isn't just a bad deal because of how much has to go out. The deal has to be looked at on the merits of the deal. So what do you mean, Samuel? Well, this is what I mean. The first thing that's important is not to assume because buying an apartment with a £3,000 service charge and a £2,000 mortgage doesn't usually make sense, that doing the same with shared ownership doesn't usually make sense. Now, the question would be why? Well, this is the reason why. If you were to go and buy a flat tomorrow, you'd be buying a flat based on your current disposable income, your current disposable or usable savings, and your current financial situation, which might mean that based on the numbers we've given a moment ago, you might only be able to qualify for a £200,000 flat. Now, if you were buying a £200,000 flat, you might end up with a 1-bedroom flat. Whereas if you tap into the shared ownership, you are now being able to acquire a £400,000 flat. Now, a good question is, what's the difference between a £200,000 flat and a £400,000 flat, right? Now, 9 times out of 10, the 2 big differences are going to be the location, because if you're spending double, you can probably end up in a better location than where you would if you were spending 200,000. And then the second thing that's super crucial that usually would be a major difference is the number of bedrooms, okay? Or let's just basically break that down to the size, okay? So with £200,000, you might be able to buy a 1 bedroom flat on the outskirts of town. Whereas with £400,000, you might be able to buy a 2 or 3 bedroom flat in a more central part of town. Okay. So you're getting value adds by being able to invest more, because half of your investment is coming from the social housing provider or the housing association or the person offering the shared ownership. All right. So hopefully this is making sense, because if this is making sense to you, you're now seeing exactly why shared ownership can be extremely valuable as a first step or first foray for someone who's brand new in property, who's looking at the landscape of the world right now, saying to themselves, look, there's absolutely no way they're going to be able to start generating property wealth in the current landscape. And my answer to you is there's actually lots of ways, and the question is just which way makes most sense for you with your current predicament and situation and scenario right now. So let's go a bit deeper. So let's say you figure out, okay, yeah, it makes sense, Samuel. Like if I was to buy it on my own right now, I would have £200,000 worth of ability, and that would put me on the outskirts. But now I'm tapping into shared ownership, which gives me £400,000 worth of ability. And now I don't have to settle for a 1 bedroom. I can go for a 3 bedroom. I don't have to settle for outskirts. I can now go more central, right? So assuming that's the trade-off. So now we have a £400,000 apartment where we are jumping in with shared ownership, but it's a 3 bedroom apartment and it's a more central location. Now, what can we do? Well, one of the things we can do is we can have lodgers. We can have 2 lodgers, right? And let's say we've got a lodger in each of the 2 separate rooms, okay? Now, each lodger, let's just say they pay us £1,000 per month. And again, we're just saying, right? If they pay £1,000 per month for the shared ability to rent the room or each room, we are now generating £2,000 per month in a house which our standard baseline costs are £2,000 per month, right? We could call it 2,250 because of the service charge as well. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just focus mainly on the £2,000 in terms of the rent and the mortgage. So by having 2 lodgers, by having 2 people that are living in 2 of the rooms out of the 3 rooms that we have in the house, we are now paying our mortgage every single month. We are now paying the ancillary and additional rent every single month. And now our revenue, our salary, the money, our hard-earned salary that we're making each month doesn't have to go towards the mortgage, doesn't have to go towards the rent, and can actually be focused on the service charge, which is £3,000 annually, close to nothing compared to what you would have been paying if you just lived in a house on your own, as well as our bills. Okay, and let's say even at an extreme level, the bills are £600 per month. Your outgoings are now 900, or thereabouts per month, maximum £1,000 per month, when it would have been closer to £3,000 a month with you living in that property on your own. Now, if you take everything I've just shared with you, you should now see, especially based on my video 2 days ago when I broke down living for free and the value of living for free, and how living for free is basically the best freedom to create to go on to create financial freedom, and then to further go on to create debt freedom. You will now understand how shared ownership can be one of multiple. We will go into these in some other videos, but how it can be a very viable mechanism to leverage and use in order to infuse your financial journey and your financial views, right? Your property investment, your wealth creation journey can be catapulted by leveraging something like shared ownership in the way that we've just basically broken it down in this video. So if this was of value to you, what I want you to do is let me know in the comments below that this was of value. What stood out to you? What did you hear that you hadn't thought about before? And what literally made you think something that you hadn't thought before about shared ownership specifically? Now, just as an extra bonus, because you've done something super solid, for me in terms of staying on this video till this part, I'm also going to give you 2 extra gold dust bonuses, right? Just around shared ownership, just to basically add value and say thank you to you, right? The first one is this. Whenever you are going to focus on shared ownership, please find out if there are any restrictions, not just the kind of restrictions I mentioned earlier in terms of your savings, etc., but if there are any restrictions about additional property purchases when you engage in that shared ownership. Okay, I remember coaching one of our Cash Flow Creation Week students a number of years ago. This is about 2.5 years ago, and she had purchased a shared ownership property prior to meeting us, etc., prior to doing any work with us. And she came on our training because she had this shared ownership property. She wanted to buy more property. She found out about how to buy more property based on what we teach in the Cash Flow Creation Week. But her shared ownership provider had a stipulation that she could not purchase any additional property until she had completely fulfilled her purchase and ownership of her shared ownership property. Okay, so that's a little caveat, little gold nugget for you to think about as well. If you're going into shared ownership, find out what other ancillary restrictions they have. Do they have restrictions on you buying other properties? Because here's an example. If you were able to get into 50% of a shared ownership property, like the example I gave earlier, but then you were able to utilize your savings to buy 2 or 3 additional properties to add to your portfolio, and those properties, the cash flow would give you enough money to buy out the other side of your shared ownership share. Why wouldn't you want to do that? Well, part of the reason you might not be able to do that / wouldn't want to do that is if there was a restriction on you being able to buy other property, right? So that's the first one. Now, second gold nugget, just to add even more value to you, is oftentimes when people go into shared ownership opportunities, there's also an opportunity for you to leverage that acquisition with another family member, right? So sometimes there's another family member who's interested in buying a property, and you can come together, you can collaborate together and both buy that 50% share, and then work together on how you can get the other 50% and other things additionally going forward. So this is just like a mini hack for you to think about, because sometimes people are like, Samuel, on my own, I don't know how I can even get 50% of a shared ownership property. But you don't have to necessarily do it on your own. And remember, if you are tapping into shared ownership, a lot of the time you can buy more, you can buy in a better location because of the fact that you're leveraging a higher valuation. With that being said, Samuel I Can Win, I'm signing out. Remember, as I usually say, small keys open big doors. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Good day. God bless. Let's go.